Okay, hi Tim, hi Malak. Thank you so much for joining me here today on Vonvo.com. It is February 17th. I just wanted to go over two quick things before we get started. Excuse me. First is that right now this conversation is being recorded. After the recording is complete and the discussion is complete, I'll be uploading the conversation to YouTube. Is that okay with both of you?
Yes, that's okay.
Great.
Yes, fine with me.
Great. And on top of that, here at Vonvo, we're all about our discussions, staying both civil and valuable. So we don't want there to be any personal attacks against anyone. Are you guys okay with those rules?
Yes.
Yes, sure.
Okay, perfect. So let's get right into it so that you can just basically give any of our viewers in the audience right now and who will watch this video later on. Malak, can you just give a quick background of yourself and how you became so passionate about this subject? And then, Tim, you can go right ahead afterwards.
Sure. My name is Malak. My parents are of Syrian descent. I was born and raised in the United States. I'm currently in Houston, Texas. I am interested in the Syrian cause for the very reason that I grew up hearing about life in Syria and what it was like growing up in a very repressive state. I am the official spokesperson for Sham News English, and so that's a big part of my activity for the revolution, trending videos and news reports out of Syria. And I'm involved in some other humanitarian activities. I'm also passionate about this subject because I'm a PhD candidate in political science, and my area of interest is regime transitions in the Middle East.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. And Tim, can you just give our viewers a quick background of yourself and why you're so passionate about this subject?
Sure, Max. Yeah, I'm an academic in Sydney, Australia, and I've been studying the Syrian conflict for a couple of years. And during that time, I joined with a number of Syrian Australians here to defend against the foreign-funded attacks.
Great. So, to get started, Malak, can you give us just your basic overall, scope on what you see going on inside of Syria, what things you have a problem with, so that we can kind of ease our way into the discussion, giving one another just, personal views on the situation over there?
Sure. The situation in Syria, for lack of a better word, has become something, I would say, very complicated. But there is something that we need to keep in mind, and that is Syria's history. Repression in Syria is not something new. It is something that has existed for many, many, many years. As I stated, my parents both grew up in Syria, and so I was very much interested in learning more about Syrian history all the time. If just to give a brief overview, in Hama in the 1980s, there was a major massacre of civilians. It was involving the Muslim Brotherhood. The point is that the government has always responded, the government in terms of the Assad family, since they took power, any opposition or any form of uprising, peaceful or otherwise, has always been met with violent repression. So there was the well-known Hama incidents of 1980s. But then, even if we look at the state of the political landscape, if we look at Syria's parliament, for example, for many years, the Ba'ath Party has controlled the parliament. Other parties are allowed to symbolically stand in the parliament, but they only have 83 seats out of versus 250 for Ba'ath Party members. So there really isn't this idea of a democratic or a pluralistic political landscape. It is very much a one party, one family controlling things, and any dissidence is seen as a threat to this power. So that is the history of Syria currently as it stands. There was a popular uprising which started in March 2011. It's been almost 2 years now. The uprising started with a very, very, what would be seen as something in any democratic country that is not a big deal. It started with some schoolboys writing a popular phrase on a wall in a school saying that the people want the fall of the regime. This phrase was echoed from other popular uprisings in the Middle East, which were happening at the time. The boys were detained, and this started a long series of events with people coming out every Friday, citizens of Syria coming out every Friday and protesting peacefully. Let's keep that in mind, that the protest started out peacefully. However, the regime did respond with violence. And as things have escalated, there has been the formation of a Free Syrian Army. So the name of them is Civil War in Syria. I would argue with the idea of a civil war, it's more about civilians who wanted to defend themselves. And of course, as I said at the very beginning, let's keep in mind that this is a conflict. Conflicts are complicated. It's not always one side versus the other. There may be other hands in the conflict, but the reality is that civilians are being killed, among them children and women. And that needs to be kept in mind. That is not okay, and it's not acceptable.
Right. Tim, do you want to respond to anything which Malak just mentioned, or do you want to go into your personal opinions? You could take either route. Go ahead.
No, Max, I think Malak's right that history is important, but I think I'll reinterpret a couple of those sections of history. It's true that the history of Syria is very important to understand this conflict. And the incident that Malak calls a massacre in Hama was really the repression of a Muslim Brotherhood uprising back at that time. And lots been written about this if you wanted to go and read it. For example, Patrick's on Assad, the father, Hafez. You can read about that. No, the serious historians called the massacre. It was an armed uprising by the Muslim Brotherhood. It was put down in the end brutally by the father of the current president. But it's incorrect to call it a massacre because it was an armed uprising that went over several years by the Muslim Brotherhood, and the attempt was to create a fundamentalist Islamist state in Syria. Now, that parties that were linked to sectarianism were banned for a very long time in Syria because the whole project after independence from the French was to create Syrian nationality because there were so many people in Syria, different types of people, majority of them Sunni Muslims, but also a range of other groups. And to create their nationality, there was a ban, I think there's still a ban, on parties that advocated sectarianism in terms of politics. And that's really the conflict that's risen now. It wasn't what Malak's part of history of the recent conflict since March 2011 resonates because it reflects what the Western media is saying for most of the last couple of years. But it's quite false, really. There was an armed uprising from the beginning in March in Daraa. In Daraa, the Saudis were providing funds to Islamist fighters there in Daraa. They fired on police and civilians, and then the army came in, and then from that point, the wider conflict began. So the idea that this is some spontaneous thing by an uprising of people is quite false. You see recently in Daraa demonstrations of people in the areas that the so-called Free Army's been trying to hold, in Aleppo, in Homs, in parts of Damascus, coming out now and saying they want to get rid of these rebels, that it's made life a hell for them. And there's really been an increase in support for the government in recent months.
Malak, do you want to respond to any of that from Tim?
Yes, I would be interested a little bit more in hearing about the Saudis providing funds in Daraa to, I guess, to serve as a catalyst for a popular uprising there. I'll be interested in hearing more about that because I'd like to know what the source for that is. Number one. Number two, actually, the information that I have, he's saying that a lot of it is from the Western media. And I can tell you something that I'm on daily contact with people inside Syria, people who are both with the Free Syrian Army and people who are civilians, who are just working as reporters, who are working simply to capture this video and risking their life to capture these videos in order to show the world what is happening on the ground in Syria. So I'd like to redirect a little bit about also the current situation in Syria. in terms of the response, the 70,000 people who have been killed in Syria, how is it possible that these armed insurgents are able to kill all of these people if that is in fact what is happening? And the other thing is, if the Syrian government has been able for all of these years to keep things relatively stable, wouldn't it be that they would be able to put down an armed insurgency? So my question to Mr. Anderson is, who is killing all of these people, all of these civilians? How is this happening? And how is the Syrian government, if they so care about their own, allowing this to happen? If it's not them doing it, if it's not documented Russian weapons doing it, then please tell me who is causing all of this loss of life.
Right, and just quickly, Tim, before you answer that, someone inside the text chat was saying if you could raise your volume a bit, that would be great. So if you just raise your volume quickly.
Okay. Well, there was a couple of questions in there, but I'll start at the end because that's what I remember. Of course, there's a conflict going on. Of course, there's two sides fighting here and people are dying on both sides. To tag them as civilians is rather misleading. If you go to, for example, the Free Army and their sources, and I didn't suggest for a moment that Malak got all her information from Western media, but I'm saying her story resonates with what the Western media has been saying. They will typically go to a source like that British-based Observatory for Human Rights, which is one man who has a FSA flag on his site, so he's a partisan for the fundamentalist uprising. They go to one site and report in an uncontradicted sort of way. So I don't doubt for a moment there are plenty of sources that Malak has in Syria or in the border areas that are saying the same thing. Now, in terms of the people dying, if you go to the Martyrs site that some of the Free Army the people have put up there, they're 90% males. Now, if there were simply, I think, as has often been reported, indiscriminate attacks on civilian areas by the army, you wouldn't be killing 90% males. In this conflict, and of course there's been killings on both sides, but a tactic which I consider a rather evil one, and that is that for reasons of trying to incite deeper foreign intervention, because there's been foreign intervention from the beginning, but it's been rather limited. You may know that President Obama, for example, has not delivered heavy weaponry to the Free Army. But in an attempt to incite greater intervention, as happened in Libya, to try and get raids to destroy the capacity of the Syrian army, for example, there's been a series of allegations there's been civilian massacres. Now, a large number of these have been the presentation of bodies of fighters, of Free Army fighters, and say in that so-called bakery massacre a while back, claiming that in other cases, such as the massacre, such as the recent mortar attacks on the university in Aleppo, and the murder of young men whose bodies were dumped in the canal at Aleppo, that one was carried out by al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda-linked group, the intention of blaming it on the Syrian army. So it's been a regular tactic from the beginning, from Daraa to fairly recently to killings, whether they're presenting them as civilian victims of the Syrian army, and in some cases the killing of civilians. We know since the attempt to take sections of Aleppo, and the so-called Free Army hasn't been successful in 2 years in really holding any section of the country. They have moved in and they've been moved out. They've taken over some bases. They've taken over some infrastructure. They've destroyed a lot of infrastructure. They haven't been able to hold significant sections of the country for very long. But very commonly they've posted videos of their own crimes on the internet, and they've often blamed the Syrian Arab Army for those crimes in an attempt to get further, deeper foreign intervention.
Right, Malak, go ahead if you'd like to respond. I'm just here moderating.
Okay, so a couple of things that I'd like to address. The documentation of the Al-Hula massacre, unless the United Nations is making up stories, they did document that regime forces and regime militias perpetrated this massacre. So if you do a simple search on the United Nations and Al-Hula massacre, you will find the evidence that no, in fact, this was a regime-perpetrated massacre. That's the first thing. And the next thing is the purpose of the uprising. It seems like Mr. Anderson is arguing that this uprising was started in order to draw other countries into this conflict, in order to gain foreign intervention in Syria, in order to bring in outside parties. And I'd like to remind Mr. Anderson that every week we see these residents that are standing and asking for freedom. They are not standing and asking for foreign intervention. They do not want foreign intervention because at the end of the day, whether they are with or against al-Assad, this is their country. This is where they were born and raised. This is where their families are. They do not want a situation in which another power is going to come in and oppress them once again. So this whole uprising started because people wanted freedom. They were sick of living in a place where they could not say what they wanted to say. And Mr. Anderson, you and I may not understand this idea of not being able to say what we want to say because we're here, we're having this debate, we're having this discussion, and there's nobody stopping us. But if you grew up in Syria, you were not allowed to say what you wanted to say. You, as a school child, you went to school, you could not utter a word about the government or your family would be in danger. As an academic, you couldn't utter what you wanted to say against the government, even if they did something wrong, because that's the way society was in Syria. There was never development of a civil society in which people could meet and discuss politics even. So that was why the revolution started. It was not because Syrians or any other group wanted foreign intervention. The third thing is addressing the Free Syrian Army and the Nusra Front. There is no doubt that there are people who are supporting both sides from the outside. But there is a difference between an army who is killing its own people and an army who had to scramble to get itself together to protect civilians. And if the Free Syrian Army is in fact unable to gain full control, as you are saying, of areas, why are there areas in Syria where people can come in and out safely? Number one. Number two, the Free Syrian Army, unless it has warplanes, which at this point it doesn't, cannot fight a full-blown army, the Syrian army, the one of Assad's army, let's call it better than the Syrian army. Assad's army has warplanes, and they are hitting these liberated areas. This is something you cannot combat if you don't have the proper weapons to do so, which the Free Syrian Army does not. So those are my responses to the last couple of points made.
Tim, would you like to respond to those?
Well, in terms of the foreign intervention, no, I'll go back to the first, I think it was the second point that Malak made, that I don't doubt for a moment that there's been restriction of civil liberties in Syria over the last 40 or 50 years. Don't doubt it for a moment. There have been emergency conditions for a long time. There's been a ban on the Muslim Brotherhood in particular. And certainly if you're in a family that was in the Muslim Brotherhood, that is to say in some of the fundamentalist sects of the Sunni community, you would be under surveillance because of the armed uprisings that had happened before. Apart from the uprising in the late 70s and early 80s, there had been Muslim Brotherhood had tried to assassinate virtually every Arab leader in the area. Some that had collaborated with Israel and the US, like Anwar Sadat in Egypt. They'd also attempted to assassinate Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt at the height of his anti-terrorism against the British. So those restrictions, you have to understand in context. There was certainly the development of a secret police, and in my reading of the opinion polls in Syria in recent years, the demand for change in Syria was indeed aimed at the dominance of the Ba'ath Party and cronyism and corruption in the system also. But there were many things that people liked about Syria. And one of the most important ones was the pluralism, the multiculturalism. The position of women was important. The status of women in Syria has been higher than most of the other regions in the country. The access to education and health and so on. So what they call a secular state there, and what in my country they would call multiculturalism, was something that many people many Syrians that I've spoken to have said that they desperately want to hang on to, and they don't want the fundamentalists of the so-called Free Army to take that over. Now, in terms of foreign intervention, Malak, I think, has outlined the sort of the dilemma there. On the one hand, she is appealing to a nationalist identity, which is certainly strong in Syria, but not really expressed by this Free Army. There are many, many video accounts you see of the Free Army talking about, we don't want democracy, we want Sharia law. It's very, very strong in a lot of the groups, not just al-Nusra. It's some of them that the US media was saying were secular, like Farouk Brigade in Homs, for example. Homs, which, by the way, the fighting has finished in Homs. There were many kilometres of tunnels laid into Homs, by the way, to bring arms into Homs when that insurrection was going on some time back. There was preparation for this uprising. It had been going on for some time, funded by the Future Movement in Lebanon, which headed by a Saudi Lebanese billionaire. So this had been a long time coming, but what Malak says at the end there about we can't fight the army and so on, this is why the call for a so-called no-fly zone. We know very well what it means. We saw it in Libya. We know that the French exacted a price for it in Libya. The French demanded a slice of the Libyan petroleum resources in response for that bombing. It was the same situation there, although Gaddafi's army was much smaller than the Syrian army. They wouldn't have taken over Libya without the NATO bombing there. And the frustration that Malak expresses there about the Syrian Air Force, it's true. If the Free Army takes over an army base or a dam or something, the army pulls back and they let them take it over. They come with planes, they wipe them out. That's what's going on. That's indeed why they can't hold certain areas. In the civilian areas, like Aleppo, for example, the civilians have moved out, and there's this full-on attack on buildings and the destruction of buildings by the Syrian army to get rid of the what they call great reason, the terrorists in those areas.
Okay, so a number of different things. In terms of emergency conditions in Syria, it is very interesting to note that Syria was under emergency law from 1963 until 2011, when the emergency law was miraculously lifted by Bashar al-Assad. Now, there is something seriously wrong with this. How is it possible that you have a popular uprising in your country and all of a sudden you decide to lift emergency law? This story is not complete. And why would you have your citizens living under emergency conditions or emergency law for all of this time and then suddenly lift the emergency law when there really was an emergency or a crisis? There is something absolutely wrong with this, and it needs explanation, and I don't think the regime can give an explanation for this. The other thing about pluralism and multiculturalism in Syria, and access to education and healthcare, I would argue that just going by statistics and by people being able to earn a living in Syria, absolutely not. Only certain members of society are able to live comfortably in Syria, and they are the members of society who make a good living. And that is very, very few people in Syria. Most people in Syria struggle every month in order to put food on the table. And that is another thing, that you do not have access to opportunities in Syria. If you are a Syrian and you have a college education, that does not guarantee that you will graduate and get a job. Granted, that could be the same in many other countries, but this idea of opportunity in Syria and being able to move up, that is something very limited in Syria. Many Syrians leave their country and go to Europe and the United States for that very reason. Especially students who are college educated, graduate, cannot find a job, and cannot raise a family. Opportunities in Syria are mainly given to people who have links to the regime. So this idea that people didn't want the uprising because they were concerned about these opportunities going away, education and healthcare, it wasn't there anyways. People rose up because they wanted freedom. They wanted to be able to move up in the world. They wanted to be able to have a life. And under the regime, that was impossible unless you were in certain sectors of society. The other thing about pluralism. Pluralism is a society in which many members have a say, in which many members can participate, in which there is acceptance of other ideas. Under Ba'ath Party rule, there is not acceptance of other ideas. Most recently, in in the late 2000s, there were 2 parliamentary members who tried to reform, and they were arrested and charged because they tried to reform some parliamentary practices. If you are a legislator in parliament, you cannot bring forth legislation, you cannot initiate legislation. You are a symbolic person who votes on legislation that is already there. The constitution of Syria is easily changed at whim of the regime. I wouldn't say that that's pluralism and multiculturalism. That's one way of thinking, and you either subscribe to this way of thinking, or you remain quiet and you live as best as you can in Syria, or you speak up and you pay a dear price with either your life or imprisonment, or the life of your family will be in danger, or you have to leave. There are countless scholars and academics who are completely secular, but they have had to leave Syria because of speaking their mind. They spoke their mind, they disagreed with something that the Assad regime, both the father or the son, did, and they had to leave Syria for that very reason. So pluralism and multiculturalism are not words I would ever use to describe Syria under either Assad the father or Assad the son. And I think, also the point about Libya, I'm not sure the point was quite clear to me. People wanted a no-fly zone in Syria, and you're saying that that would help the Free Syrian Army, but at the same time you're saying foreign intervention happened in Libya for oil. And so you're saying this, I'm not sure where you were going with that point. If you could just clarify a little bit for me.
Yeah, let me respond first to that long and rather eloquent account you gave, or critique of pluralism. I agree with a lot of it in respect of political pluralism, but I was referring to social pluralism. Now, you know, if you were a Sunni person, for example, in Syria, and maybe you are a Sunni person, but not in Syria, if you were a Sunni person, there were no barriers to you going to university, to you coming through the government system and so on. Socially, in terms of having trusted positions, different story. The political system was illiberal. The cronyism was a great source of complaint in terms of what you mentioned, that in terms of, you know, what jobs you would get and so on. So that indeed was at the root of the reform process and still a reform movement. And I've heard 2 important critiques of President Bashar al-Assad in the last couple of years, and one was he had promised reform and didn't deliver on it. That was one thing. The other one was, or delivered too slowly on it, because indeed there were elections where some new parties came in 2005, and then there were these elections during the conflict in 2012. It isn't true, by the way, to say that they changed the constitution at a whim. They did have elections about a year ago. The participation rate was 51%, which was not overwhelming, but it was much higher than the congressional elections in the US recently. And in that election, by the way, last year, the Ba'ath Party got 60% of the votes. So your figure earlier about 250 to 80, I think, is talking about the coalition. The Ba'ath Party is now in a coalition with some other parties, 2 of the communist parties, I think the Social National Party and so on. That's a coalition government now, and there are some that are outside that in Parliament too. There is a sort of a reform process going on now. It is belated. It's true to say you've got this reform process or so-called liberalisation, which you can't really have in a crisis. It's a genuine contradiction there. But nevertheless, it's happening. And it hasn't been very widely reported in the Western press, but there was a large meeting in Tehran. There was one in Geneva just recently. And the visit of Mr. Al-Khatib to Russia recently tells you something about what's going on here. Here's a man, supposedly, what do they call him, a moderate Muslim leader. In any case, he went to Russia, came back and announced that he wants to talk to, quote-unquote, the regime. What's going on there? There is a process going on. The FSA is not making ground. The coalition appointed by Hillary Clinton and the others in Doha hasn't really got much traction, and the Russians, I believe, have told them, you better start talking because there are other people here, other oppositionists, civil oppositionists, ones that don't go out and put pictures of them cutting off heads and saying they want Sharia law and saying Christians root Alawites to the grave, these sort of sectarian, really genocidal slogans. There is a discussion going on, and Al-Khatib and some of the people in that coalition, the Muslim Brotherhood members, are not happy with this, are trying to maneuver themselves in some sort of way to start to get involved in these talks so they don't get frozen out. So there is indeed a reform process going on. There are contradictions in it, as Malak has said, but it's happening, and it's having some impact on the so-called coalition based in Cairo.
Okay. So about the social pluralism, again, I go back to you may have, first of all, getting into a university in Syria is not this easy walk in the park. I don't know how much you know about the high school system in Syria, but the high school system in Syria is very difficult. And students are so stressed about these exams because they know that they will determine their future. And if you do not, and oftentimes these students will study and study and study, and not studying like we know. I mean, these students will seriously apply themselves for months and months and months, and then not get enough points to get into a university. And so it is not that easy to go to a university. And once you get to a university, the whole point of a university education is not only for you to be able to graduate with a degree, it's to allow you to blossom as a person, right? To be able to exchange, it's a free exchange of thoughts and ideas, and that is not the case in universities in Syria. So I would say even social pluralism in Syria, that would be very debatable. The other thing is, in elections in Syria, regardless of the turnout, it's always interesting to note the percentage of people who voted for Assad time and time again. And so it's very difficult to imagine that a free and fair election would produce 99.9% results or 98.9% results for one party or one group time after time after time. If you look at the Freedom House indicators for Syria, including political rights, civil liberties, the freedom rating overall, for years and years and years, that rating has been 7, which is the worst that you can do on the Freedom House indicators. So this idea of pluralism or a democracy or even moving towards reform, that's very difficult for me to say, yes, Syria is moving towards reform. Third thing, is reform killing people in order that you may hang on to power? Is reform refusing to step down when your own citizens don't want you as a president anymore? And that's not reform. That's not any kind of reform. The last thing is you're speaking about videos that are produced by people who call themselves the Free Syrian Army, and you're saying that they're advocating for Sharia law in these videos, very sectarian videos. I would, first of all, people for the revolution, if you talk to activists, nobody wants a society in which you are not free to be who you want to be. Nobody wants a society in which religion or certain ideals will be pushed onto people. And just speak to a few of the activists, and this is not what they are fighting for. This is not what they are putting their lives on the line for. They simply want freedom. They want freedom not only for themselves as a Muslim or as a Christian or as a Druze or even as an Alawite. They want freedom and equal opportunity for all members of society. And that has been the call again and again. If such videos are being produced in the name of the Free Syrian Army, that is not the goal of the Free Syrian Army, and I feel confident in saying that. There are extremists in every land, and they will take advantage of crises such as is happening in Syria. And so just because there are such videos being produced, that does not mean that this is the sentiment of the majority of revolutionaries or people fighting in the Free Syrian Army. And the other thing is, there are countless videos also emerging from Alawite soldiers calling Sunnis all kinds of wicked names and cursing them in unimaginable ways. And not only that, torturing them in unimaginable ways, catching this on video, and then spreading it around. So this idea that these videos represent all Alawites, that would be unfair. They do not represent all Alawites, because not all Alawites will treat human beings in this manner. So such videos, again, are a minority, number one. Number two, they do not represent the revolution. They do not represent what people are fighting for on the ground.
Okay, let me respond to that, because I've got a long list here. It's growing. It's true what you said about Alawis. Of course, let's remember, most of the Syrian army is Sunni. Most of the Syrian army is Sunni, and despite the efforts of the so-called Free Army, they haven't fractured on sectarian grounds. Sunnis have always been in the leadership of the army, as well as Alawis and others there, and Christians. So, of course, if you're talking about, ordinary soldiers being upset at their opponents, that's another story. Let me start back at the beginning there, the social pluralism university. What you said there is quite true, of course, about, it's not that easy to get to university, to get a career out of, and so on. That's all quite, but it's true in your whole country too. It's true in the United States. However, if the Salafis in this Free Army have their way, we know it's very clear that a woman such as yourself is not going to get to university at all. It's not going to be open to women to go to university in that sort of system. We know that they've been stopping women from driving cars in Aleppo, in the areas that they control. So the social pluralism is something actually that really is stressed by most of the Syrians I've been talking to, including those that aren't big fans of Bashar al-Assad. A lot of the Christians, for example, are not big fans of Bashar al-Assad, but they know that his system is much better for minorities and much better than the alternative. And they don't have illusions about that are really put out in the Western media, and I think Malak's just contributed to that. That, look, here's al-Nusra on one side, and here's the good guys, the secular Free Syrian Army on the other side. I know this is a studied sort of image that's been put out, and indeed when, but you can see the reaction to it when President Barack Obama in the US, I think, purported to ban or prescribe al-Nusra as, al-Qaeda linked, and they're terrorists, and they're separate from the Free Syrian Army that we support. 29 groups in Aleppo came out and said, we are all al-Nusra, we support them. They are in front of what we're doing. And I went and did a study after that myself, and I posted it on Facebook, and anyone that wants to have a look at it can see it. I looked at, there's about 16 of the major FSA groups, mainly in Aleppo, but also in Homs, Baruch in Homs. I couldn't find one that was not Islamist. They were all Salafi, Muslim Brotherhood families. One way or the other, they had an Islamist agenda, and they weren't so far from al-Nusra. Al-Nusra, of course, has actually a good reputation amongst them as being effective, and, well, they're the ones that really notably carry out the atrocities, like the recent murder of those young men whose bodies were dumped in the river in Aleppo, like the mortar attack on Aleppo University, which they claimed responsibility for on their website, but then pulled it down when some of the other of their colleagues then started trying to blame it on the Syrian army. So that's one thing. The elections, 99%. There hasn't been a 99% election for a long time. In 2005, other parties came into the parliament. Last year, the Ba'ath Party, as I said before, got 60% of the elections. The presidential elections are set for June 2014. I would say the way things are going, that's probably going to happen. It's probably going to happen. I suspect, just as an outside observer, the presidential elections of June 2014 will go ahead. Bashar al-Assad probably will be a candidate for those elections. It will be a genuinely open election in the sense that other people who've engaged in the process, in a civil process, that is to say, will participate in some way. So there has been some level of genuine competition, and shown by the fact that the Ba'ath Party now only has 60% of the seats in the parliament. You said Freedom House. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, I'm not going to really give much credibility to Freedom House because it's an old Cold War institution. It follows or helps lead US foreign policy. I'm not really going to go into those ratings there. Reform, killing people, of course, you're right about that. Reform is not about killing people. It's why, the other side to your argument says, and I noticed, by the way, you may have seen in the BBC 2 days ago, the BBC has a very unusual headline. It says, I'll read it here. It says, people want Assad to stay. People want Assad to stay. It's a headline in the BBC. Very unusual because the British government, the BBC didn't do anything different to the British government for a long time. Now the British government is starting to change its tune because they're worried about the blowback from a number of the fundamentalists from Britain that have been sent to Syria and perhaps are starting to come back to Syria. One thing we haven't mentioned, it should be mentioned, is there are very large numbers of, have always been very large numbers of foreign fighters, particularly from the middle of last year in Syria. Many thousands of Libyans, many thousands of Tunisians, many thousands of Pakistani Taliban. Prisoners released from Saudi jails. We know that documents have shown that the Saudis have pardoned. There was one list of 1,300 prisoners and that. So a large number of foreigners have been involved in these attacks. And of course, those attacks can keep on going so long as Turkey sets the bases for the Free Army, as there are financiers in Lebanon, so long as Saudis and Qatar, the Saudis are a little bit nervous about this now. Qatar is fully behind the Muslim Brotherhood. The Saudis are a bit worried because they are more pragmatic, let's say. They're concerned about their own necks in Saudi Arabia. If you think people are fighting for freedom, have a look at the backers of this so-called revolution. Have a look how much freedom you've got in Saudi Arabia, how much freedom you've got in Qatar, particularly as a woman. You'll see how much freedom those people are fighting for by looking at those societies that are backing this revolution.
Okay, so there's a number of different points to respond to. I'd just like to ask you one question really quickly. You keep saying that this is a revolution for the Muslim Brotherhood, but then you say Salafists. It's almost like you're using the term interchangeably. First of all, the Muslim Brotherhood is a political entity, and it has made itself a political entity. It has reformed itself and appeared in very different forms in different countries. So I'm not sure, if you're using Muslim Brotherhood and Salafis and fundamentalists all interchangeably. Each one of them has an agenda, and each one of them has connotations. So I'm not sure what you mean by these groups when you're saying them. If they're all the same.
I'll clarify it now if you're right. I'll clarify it now. You're right, there are differences there, and the Farouk Brigade, for example, of the FSA is a Muslim Brotherhood brigade. They are fundamentalists, they're Islamists also, but they have significant conflict with al-Nusra, and they've been fighting and killing each other. So it's true that there are significant differences, not unexpected amongst sectarian groups, and Takfiri groups, which, to explain that term, is people that believe it's okay to kill other people who are apostates or part of another faith. Now, there is conflict within those groups, but they are both Islamist, fundamentalist Islamists, and they want an Islamist state.
So my question is then, you keep saying that in Syria the quest is that these people are trying to develop some kind of completely Islamist society. However, number one, you mentioned a video by the FSA in which you said they all supported the Nusrat Front. I'm sorry, that video was not, it didn't even take a day for the FSA in Aleppo, with all of its different groups, to come out and strongly deny any connection to the Nusrat Front. Not only deny the connection, they denounced the Nusrat Front. If you talk to Free Syrian Army members and interview them, as I have, you will know that they keep their distance from this front. The front may be trying to help them, and I'll put that in quotations. However, Free Syrian Army members on the ground, soldiers, people who are fighting, deny any connection with this group because they do not want an extremist Syria. They do not want an extremist environment to be developed in their country. That is not what they are fighting for. They are fighting.
Would you like to hear the ones that you support? Would you like to hear the ones? I can read you out the ones that do, if you like, from my research.
No, I'm not finished. So if there are people who support such a thing, that's normal in any conflict. You will have people who support extremism in any conflict. I'm not denying that there are such people, but what I am saying is that in general, the Free Syrian Army is fighting for freedom. And to keep saying that they're not, it means you're ignoring everything that's coming out of Syria. You're reading other sources, and unfortunately, other sources can say whatever they want because they're not on the ground. They're not with these people.
I'm reading their own words. I'm reading their own words. That's what I'm going to quote back to you.
Okay, I'm almost finished. Now, let's go back to Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Qatar and their support for the Free Syrian Army, as well as the environments in which women live in these countries. So I was very recently in Qatar, and women, first of all, have university educations, probably more than men. Women in Qatar can drive. Women in Qatar have freedom. Okay, Saudi Arabia, and in terms of its support for the Free Syrian Army, that has been there are documented cases of people speaking out for the Syrian revolution being arrested in Saudi Arabia. So I'm not sure how the Saudi government would be, supporting the revolution, so-called, by financial means, yet at the same time they're arresting Syrian revolutionaries who go to their country. Something doesn't add up there. And then the last thing is, the FSA has been very much on its own in all of this. Very little support is reaching them. If more support were reaching them, we would see a different situation on the ground, a situation which you yourself are saying they cannot gain control because they don't have the means to do so. They are not getting the support from the outside. And then finally, okay, I'll let you go ahead and
okay. Guys, just quickly, I just want to chime in here. Tim, please, obviously go ahead and respond. In about 10 minutes, I'm going to be going and creating another room for another discussion that's going to be taking place. You guys are free to continue speaking. I hope that you guys are getting, something out of, conversing with one another. I'll be creating another room, and any of the people watching, I've been on social media, and I think we've populated this room a bit. They'll be able to continue listening, and you guys can continue going. So I just wanted to give you that heads up. And if you wanted to, Tim, after you respond, if you wanted to then maybe discuss what are the next steps you believe going forward, I think that would be great to hear both of your perspectives on that topic. Okay.
Okay. I think the most important thing Malak raised was this question of the nature of the Free Syrian Army and whether it is fighting for freedom or whether it is a fundamentalist Islamist movement. Let me read out to you, because I've asserted it, but now let me give you some of the evidence of the people at back. It's not al-Nusra as simply as the Islamists and sectarians. All of the largest groups, Tawhid, Farouk, Liwa al-Umar, Khalid bin Walid, Mohammed Sultan Fateh, Ara al-Sham, are either Salafi or Muslim Brotherhood backed, and Malak is right, there are tensions between them. Also, the most prominent army defectors are Islamists committed to a religious state, such as Brigadier General Zaki al-Luli, Lieutenant Mohammed Tlas, and Colonel Abdul Jabbar al-Qaidi. For example, here's some of the groups that are linked in network, apart from who are mainly foreigners, and as we know, linked to al-Qaeda in Iraq. The Liwa al-Tawhid is meant to be the biggest in Aleppo province. Abu Ahmed, the unit leader, admits support for Assad in Aleppo is very high, 70%, so these people are saying the people actually support Assad more than us. He praises in the same breath al-Nusra as the cleanest of all the groups there. Ara al-Sham, the Free Men, are Islamist and Salafist. They want an Islamic regime with Sharia. That's a nationwide group, adherents of the Salafis. They say they're not part of the FSA. The Mohammed Sultan Islamists, headed by army defector. There's also, for example, I'm not going to go through all of these. It's a little tedious to go through all of them. The US advisors, for example, pretended that the Farouk Brigade in Homs was secular. In fact, they're the ones that blew up Homs Hospital, and their slogan was, "The penalty to unbelievers is death." They blew up Homs Hospital because it was treating soldiers. Khalid bin Walid Brigade in Homs also, US advisors pretended that one's secular. In fact, it's loyal to and supported by the Muslim Brotherhood. So I can go through these. I've published something on this. I can go through them one by one. All the major fighting groups have a very strong Islamist agenda, be it from the Muslim Brotherhood links or from foreign Salafis. And there are significant conflicts between them, but they share that agenda. There is not a secular nature of it. And that is, of course, why the British government is now worried about the blowback of those fundamentalists who've gone from Britain. Quite a number from Australia too, by the way. The Australian government admits over 100 have gone there. Several of them have been killed in Syria. They're worried about the blowback of this coming back to their country. I'm glad Malak thinks Qatar's a bastion of freedom. You know, if she thinks it's great for women in Qatar, there's an absolute dictator there, but it's the least democratic of all the countries in the region. There's a man who's the king there who deposed his father in a coup to rule that country and become the billionaire that he is, funding mayhem around the region. It's true the Saudis are somewhat different now because they're worried about the Muslim Brotherhood. They're worried about that. They were quite happy with Mubarak in Egypt, for example. They don't like to upset the status quo too much. The Saudis are now talking to President Bashar al-Assad. That's one of the problems that the Free Army has, that their financial backers are getting divided over the outcome of this. They're not seeing good results. They wanted a short-term outcome. They wanted a short-term result. They're not getting it in Syria, and that's why people like Al-Khatib in Cairo are now saying, well, perhaps we've got to talk to, quote-unquote, the regime.
Okay, I'd just like to correct something there. I never said that it was a bastion of freedom. I'm telling you that I was there, and these are my observations, but that's aside from the point. The point is that you're giving a picture that all Islamists, as you're calling them, or any group that has Islamic leanings is going to take over Syria, and that is the point, to create a so-called Islamic government. Again, I will reiterate that people who are putting their lives on the line are doing so because they want freedom, and they are defending their women, their children, their brothers, their sisters. And there are documented people who have joined the Free Syrian Army simply because their entire family has been killed by the Assad regime. Now, in terms of where Syria is going to go from this, the hope is that there will be free and fair elections, that the regime, first before anything else, the regime has to go. The regime has done enough damage to this country, and if Bashar Assad cares about his country like he so claims, he would step down and he would allow a transition government to take over and for things to change. If in fact, one of these groups that you say is extremist wins power in parliament or wins the presidency, if in fact this happens, which it could, a Muslim Brotherhood group could in fact lead parliament in Syria if free and fair elections are held. This was the choice of the people, at least. At least it wasn't imposed on them.
The last thing they want is elections. They don't want to participate in elections. They kill people who participated in the last elections. They're saying the same now. They don't want to participate in elections.
I'm sorry. I'm not finished, one. And two, also, the Muslim Brotherhood, again, we don't know how they're going to react. Number three, which is most important. Syrian citizens have fought for 2 years, and they have lost lives for 2 years not to return to a country where they would be ruled by extremists. They are not going to allow that to happen. And so, let's forget everything else. This is a revolution for freedom, and 70,000 people dead means that in the future, Syrians are going to be very careful about who they put in power. It's been enough 40 years of somebody being imposed on them and controlling everything, every aspect of their lives, limiting their opportunities, limiting everything. That's not going to happen. And so if in fact an extremist group, as you say, this is the fear, if in fact that were to happen, Syrians are not going to
just look at Libya.
Happening.
Just look at Libya.
What
a disaster.
Look at Libya, what?
Those that have been calling for the caliphate in Syria have been contemplating, as has the US administration in some of its sections, a fracturing of Syria. Syria doesn't have the oil that Iraq and Saudi Arabia has, but strategically it's very important.
I missed the last thing you said. It kind of, I don't know if it broke up or what.
I said Syria doesn't have the oil that Iraq had, but it's strategically extremely important to control of the region. And it's important in terms of the positioning that NATO has been doing in that region for quite a while. You would know, as a student of history, that the US administration had a plan some 10 years ago to take over 7 countries in the region, half of which they've done already. So strategic control of the region is very important there in terms of the big powers outside Syria.